Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 21 cheat sheet. And the reason why we're looking at this video so late is because I wanted to wait for any potential double game week provisional news. And we actually got it today with the Premier League announcing that there will be a potential double game week fixture between United and Leeds depending on future results in cup ties. So in the FA Cup, as long as United and Leeds continue and progress without a draw, then we will have this double game week fixture between United and Leeds. What's interesting about this is you now have the potential to go and maintain your triple United stack, where if you, let's say, own Martial, you have probably 2 weeks now to pivot into something like Fernandes quite easily. And this is a good week, for example, to even move out of someone like Martial, who just doesn't seem like he can actually last for 2 games, if we're being quite honest, or even last 60 minutes on the pitch. So beyond that, I would say, obviously, the strength of Leeds' asset has risen incredibly because they already had a great fixture run. Getting to add at least a provisional 2 points on top of that is going to be a huge plus for why you'd like to go into a Leeds asset. And we have seen that their XG stats are very high, so it's very interesting to tempt yourself with a Leeds attack, or potentially even this week, because they're playing Brentford. But Brentford, of course, as we've been talking about, have been a very resilient team. If we start with the midfield, though, you have someone like Bailey who has joined the cheat sheet again. And the reason why is simply because you have some faith that Bailey will actually play consistent minutes as a starter under the new manager. And that's simply what we've been seeing. Yes, of course, this could be a little bit of recency bias just because he had such a great game last time out. But Aston Villa actually have a really good set of fixtures around key fixture points. So 25 is a really good fixture point for someone going into Bailey. And Andreas doesn't seem like the asset that would really want to hold, specifically if you already hold Mitrovic in your team. He also has great fixtures in the short term, so there's no reason to really stop yourself from going for Bailey, as his bad fixtures are actually fixtures where you hopefully have these assets between Arsenal and City players who are going to start for your team anyway. So Bailey is someone that you're really just calling upon deep in your bench when the fixture arises, and 25 is going to be a good example of that, just because you'll have probably something like 3 United, Newcastle, Brentford assets, if those are the kind of blank game weeks that we're going to face. Same with Brighton assets as well. As far as the next tier, you have someone like Almiron who stays there, and potentially the question this week would have been whether to de-rank Almiron. In my opinion, I still think he's actually very active in the box. Yes, he's started to be subbed off a little bit earlier, I would say, than expected. His X minutes clearly aren't 90, but for me, he's still the clear starter in this team. Newcastle are still creating enough chances. I think, yes, they've definitely underscored in recent memory, and the reality is Almiron is still taking a lot of shots, and he's still taking a lot of opportunities that I like for him to actually be valued as a good asset in our teams. As far as March and Mitoma, though, these are 2 assets that, despite potentially having a high chance of a blank game week 25, just simply have looked incredible. March, of course, has shown a little bit more clinical precision, and that's obviously been reflected in the points scored, whereas Mitoma has actually done a little bit more in terms of the analytical point of view. So I'm just looking at XG and XA as well. He's also an incredible dribbler, so we can obviously see that March is a very clear outlet on this Brighton team. They're looking for the sort of diagonal through ball to March, and that was something that we saw, or to Mitoma rather, and that was something that we saw be frequently used in the Everton game, where, for example, he was able to break through from Patterson, who made a defensive mistake. And then, of course, Mitoma was a consistent outlet versus Trent on that sort of right-hand side of Liverpool's defense last week out. So I do really like Mitoma in terms of how much he's creating. Whether you actually choose between the two and who to pick from, I'm still leaning towards Mitoma, but if you're someone who really does believe in the quality of finishing and someone actually continuing this kind of red hot streak of form, I would say March is interesting because, yes, he had a 2-goal, 1-assist game versus Liverpool, but he frankly could have had a 3-goal, 1-assist game. He was, of course, offside for one of the goals that was disallowed, but he's just gotten into all these central attacking positions, and it's really lovely to see that from March. As far as Olise and Eze, despite, of course, Olise having such a fantastic free kick, I still would say he's probably worth just downgrading. I just think that Crystal Palace and their attack have been really lackluster, and when you're looking at an asset that already is in the same price point as players like Almiron and March and Mitoma, there just isn't really any value there. Crystal Palace seem to have some pretty tough games. They didn't look particularly good versus United. Yes, of course, they managed to sneak a draw, and I think United were pretty poor in the second half in terms of actually managing the game, controlling the game, trying to stop Crystal Palace from actually creating effective attacks. But the reality is they're just better assets in the game at this point in time, and Crystal Palace don't seem to have the doubles that kind of suggests they're worth going into, beyond the weeks where they actually have double game weeks. So for me, I would say the next tier is where you have these S+ players in the league, and Rashford, Odegaard, and Martinelli are all green assets, but I think they're really a tier above. I just didn't want to make the cheat sheet more complex than it really could be. I would say Rashford, Odegaard, Martinelli are probably the best assets in the game. We've talked about Saka recently. I'm a Saka owner myself, and I've always championed in the last few weeks that Odegaard seems to be the asset to own from this Arsenal team. Yes, that's currently backed up by the current point score, but the reality is you are paying a little bit cheaper for an Arsenal asset who already is doing incredibly when it comes to shots on target, when it comes to actually matching some of his wingers in terms of total shots per game, and he just has the underlying stats when it comes to expected goals as this sort of 10 who frequently fills into great positions in the box. So I do really love Odegaard as an asset, and I think, yes, there's a value to Saka having penalties, but potentially there isn't that value there for him to be 1.2 million more than someone like a Martin Odegaard. Of course, the penalties will hopefully come for Saka owners, but I think there's no reason to not go into Odegaard, specifically if it's the price point that you can actually meet. As far as Rodrigo, he's someone who rises this week. And the reason why I like Rodrigo so much is because of this provisional fixture. I'd say there's probably only a 20% chance that either United or Leeds draw in their cup games, which means that that double game week is extremely likely. And not to mention as well that Rodrigo has played very, very consistent minutes as of late. I also like the fact that Rodrigo is someone who seems to have the faith of the manager once again. He's been playing consistently as the striker of the team. We did, of course, see that Bamford came in the cup game when it was sort of over, I would say, to actually score a brace. But Rodrigo is still getting a lot of shots on target, and you can see that even in the previous game stats, still taking the absolute most amount of shots for this Leeds team. So potentially the priority target if you have the space or the capacity to move into a midfielder this week that isn't a March/Matoma transfer. As far as Mahrez, of course, we rated him highly in the week, but I think the reason that he's still top tier 1 is he's got another double coming up. It's very clear that there isn't a competitor to his position on the right. You also saw, for example, Alvarez, who at points in the season was competing with him in this position on the right, was actually playing more in a central position. So United kind of attacking it in a little bit more of a kind of 3 at the back structure to start the game versus Tottenham, but then moved more in towards a back 4 with Rico Lewis playing a little bit more of a traditional fullback role. But Mahrez still looked incredible in that game. Someone who's actually still making runs in behind and much more incisive than both Foden and Grealish, who have actually been pretty boring to watch on the left, if I have to be honest. And Antony and Zaha just simply not worth it. Antony also now frequently rotated, too expensive in my opinion, and then Zaha still playing, of course, as the talisman of a team that's been pretty ineffectual from the offensive point of view. So no real reason to move into those assets. As far as Saka in this tier of 8 to 8.5, I might have been remiss to actually miss out Kulusevski. I think Kulusevski is still an interesting asset. It's actually nice to see that he's come back from injury, immediately scored versus City. Was he that impactful in the City game? I would say not really. I think it was an Ederson mistake that really allowed him to score. But Kulusevski, we know he's got a fantastic finesse on the left foot. I just think that he is still a little bit pricey in the game. And if you do own Foden, I completely understand just downgrading and moving elsewhere in the midfield, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend moving directly into Kulusevski. I still think there's a little bit lacking there compared to something like a Saka asset-wise. And as far as the 10 plus assets, I've made a complete rejig of it where you have Fernandes rising and then De Bruyne and Salah falling. The simple reality is De Bruyne and Salah have been pretty abysmal. De Bruyne got rested in the previous match, but overall, since the World Cup restart, has been pretty poor. He's been unlucky, I would say, to not get the amount of assists that he should have deserved, I suppose, with the quality of the balls that he's been putting in some of the games. John Stones hitting the post versus Everton is a good example of that. But overall, his dominance over certain games in the Premier League has dropped considerably. And the same thing with Salah as well. Not getting as many shooting opportunities. And frankly, I think the team looks dire without Darwin leading that line. And I think, of course, Salah's ability to haul as an asset is actually now a little bit predicated on whether Darwin actually returns. And that also makes him, not worthwhile. It just simply suggests that probably Darwin's the asset to own if you're able to move or hold, let's say, one Liverpool asset. Whereas Fernandes has a very, very close impending double game week 22. Not fully confirmed, but he's already showing and occupying some great positions depending on the starting 11 of United. We've seen Fernandes play at a right wingish position that allows him to actually still move very much all around the pitch. And then we've also seen him occupy positions in that sort of 10 spot sometimes where he does fill in. But of course, he plays an overall defensive box-to-box role for the team as well. So if you look at the goal versus Crystal Palace, of course, occupying that sort of half space, which is where you'd expect a 10 to sit and actually wait for the ball late from Eriksen. Potentially also a very poor kind of defensive lapse from Crystal Palace, leaving so much space to Fernandes. But his underlying stats have been fantastic. But I would say the added benefit of just having doubles, having penalties, is probably suggests actually that Bruno is going to be the asset to own in this sort of price tier. And as we know that with the season FPL, you really don't need much money to actually have probably the best team possible. As far as the forwards, we have some significant changes here. And I would say the significant changes, the rejigging of that sort of 5.5 to 6.9 position, I've added onto the cheat sheet simply because he's been one of the leaders for this Leeds team in terms of minutes. He's also clearly been presented with a lot of faith from the manager to actually try and push up in the table with his Leeds team. I think he's also been very effectual from the attacking point of view. We saw him get some pretty dangerous numbers in the previous game in the Premier League, but also, of course, a brace in the recent Cup game. But I would say Nonto is an asset that's worth playing around with because he's at 5.0, a very cheap asset that allows you to flexibly move in potentially the midfield positions, reoccupying that 3-5-2 structure that a lot of people seem to prefer because midfielders, of course, naturally will find easier ways to get points. As far as Johnson, I like him because the run for Nottingham Forest is very sweet, and we've also seen a much more improved Nottingham Forest team when it comes to form. His finishing was very, very good in the previous game versus Leicester. I would say the first game in the season versus Leicester, it was abysmal. I mean, he had pretty much an open net to score into, and he totally missed the opportunity. This is a case of whether you'd like to back someone who you'd hope as a young player is able to develop and actually show some form. Gibbs White, for example, has had pretty good games this season, has found opportunities to actually get onto the goal tally and also just get points from the FPL point of view. And these are the best fixtures really for Nottingham Forest players to do it. Johnson is someone who's probably nailed into the team and also plays a lot more minutes. So if you see someone like Awani, he does get substituted off quite early in games, whereas Johnson seems to have the faith of the manager to play the full 90 minutes. So his X-Mins is very high. I do like him as a pick to go this week, but I like the upside of Nonto playing free fixtures very, very shortly. That being Brentford and then Nottingham Forest with a Man United double there. So that for me seems to be a very nice 3-fixture run compared to Johnson's Bournemouth and Leeds. And I think they're pretty much equivalent assets at this point in time. And the simple reason is because there is a chance, of course, that Nonto will have to deal with the competition of Sinisterra in that kind of forward position. As far as the asset tier of 7 to 8.9, I've re-included Tony into the cheat sheet. And I think, look, we've been waiting for him to be suspended. I mean, when he's been charged with that many amount of breaches, I think a lot of us expected for him to be suspended already, and he hasn't been. I can't deny that Tony's a fantastic player. He's always been featuring the cheat sheet prior to the betting scandal. But I'm not sure. I've not heard any official news on Tony so far. I have to re-include him to the cheat sheet with an asterisk. I do think it's worthwhile to go into Tony this week, but now that the chance of that double versus United doesn't seem to be there, I do really like the opportunity of sidestepping Tony for the safety of your team in the future. I can understand people going from Martial to Tony because it feels like you're sort of maintaining the same problem, which is of course the blank game week in 25. But if you're someone who, let's say, owns Mitrovic, or a player who is set to play in blank game 25 and you're moving into Tony, I'd probably still sidestep that transfer because I think there's a bit of risk there. However, as I say, if you are a Martial owner, very simple move to go to Tony this week. Wilson, still not that interested in him. I think he had plenty of chances in the previous game versus Fulham. Didn't take them so sweetly. I think he hit some fantastic turns, but the finishing just isn't there for whatever reason. I think we've seen Wilson, of course, in different bouts of form. So far, it's been a little bit tame from him, even though the XG looks great. The underlying numbers look great. I think I'd still back Wilson over this period, but is it worth actually spending that much money in a forward who can also be substituted at 75 minutes, as we've seen in recent games? Probably not. I'd probably back someone like Tony for the short-term punt, or even someone like Nonto who's got that double game week fixture. That also allows you to spread more money around the team. And maybe you just don't want to hold that many Newcastle assets because, of course, the problem with Newcastle assets is going to be navigating blank game week 25 if that does arise. So for me, Darwin, Holland, Kane, these are all top assets. We've been talking about Darwin, and potentially a lot of people will say that Darwin is now an overpriced asset, someone who is sitting at that kind of 8.8 price and looks very, very pricey. I would say that Darwin still looks interesting to me. I think he's been the talisman of this Liverpool team, and whenever he plays, I feel like their ability to create chances and to actually play through him as that sort of talisman increases dramatically. And frankly, Liverpool in recent weeks without Darwin has looked incredibly dire from the attacking point of view. We've seen Trent actually send and deliver quite a few good balls. Not many people actually being able to take the opportunities, such as Gakpo last week. He is occupying more so of a Firmino role, traditionally speaking, so I don't think his ceiling is that high. I'm not going to add Gakpo to the cheat sheet quite yet, but Darwin is someone I still have a tremendous faith in if he's fit, and that's why the asterisk is on him. And Holland, Kane, nothing really to say about them. Of course, Holland, you could argue it's a bit of regressing to the mean. Of course, he had some fantastic numbers, overinflated goal scoring at the start, but I would say City overall as a team seems to have dropped off a cliff, and it's not really a Holland-centric problem. I don't think he's the issue, and I don't think we can't just suddenly change the narrative and say that the City team is worse with him in it. I think the City team has shown plenty of times in the past that they were able to move through a bad run and recover very quickly. So I'd still keep the faith. I'd probably still be captaining him week to week, and that's simply the reality with Holland. If we move into the defenders now, I don't think there's been actually many changes in defenders, and that's why I don't really want to talk too much about them. There's not really many more teams that I'm interested in. I've actually dropped Doherty because I think Emerson had a pretty solid game versus City, not simply because he scored, but I think defensively he showed some good progression. However, the attacking point of view, I mean, look, he took a terrible shot. I probably remember in the first half, something that probably went sky high, but he is still active and actually filling in good positions in the team. And we just know that there's too many chances for the Spurs team to succumb to rotation. Perisic, for example, can have a very poor half and then immediately be rotated. And the same thing goes for Doherty, even though he might be the preferred right back. And that's why I probably would like to sidestep Doherty if I was someone thinking about ever going for a Spurs wing back. That's just the reality of the situation. When you have teams like Arsenal and United, who have assets that are at similar prices, are playing nailed, or at least getting subbed off at the sort of right minute, with the exception to that one time Ben White got subbed off at 59. I really like the availability of these defenders in these teams and their nailed minutes, and that's why Doherty has to fall. Trent and Robertson also fall. Look, the fence has been woeful. Van Dijk is out now for a while, and yeah, I mean, as an Alexander-Arnold owner, I am probably heavily regretting that move. But the fixture run looks pretty good, with exception to the Newcastle game. So that's kind of the position right now with Liverpool, and you kind of have to just take it as it is. Frankly, that Liverpool are a team that still look like they can actually show some good signs from attack, but the defensive point of view, it's just been appalling. The one upside you have from these fullbacks is the attacking, which you can fall back on, but the valuation of them, it's not really worth it, and I'd probably just rather back a Newcastle asset beyond blank game week 25. As far as the keepers, there's not really been many changes. I've only dropped Guaita because, of course, the double game week has come and gone for Crystal Palace, and I really think things are exactly as they are. Kepa and Sanchez both have interesting games. Sanchez might also be the asset to own if you have some sort of wild card potential, but I really don't see the point of going for Sanchez for now. I think Ramsdale is also a very, very good asset to own if you're stuck as to whether you want to own an Arsenal defender. If you're also on a sort of wildcard situation, and Ederson, I mean, I've put him as a green here. We saw a huge mistake in the Tottenham game, but the fixtures beyond Tottenham in 22 are very, very clean and very good for Ederson. So if you've invested into that structure, I really wouldn't move away from it, because simply put, the defenders from City just haven't been appetizing. And that's kind of the state of the cheat sheet right now. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.